Okay, guys, we're going to start with the Dred Scott decision. We already read about this in class and discussed it, so we're not going to spend much time on it. Um, all right, so let's hustle through it. Okay, so the Who, clearly Dred Scott, he was the slave, if you'll remember. He was taken to free territory, and he sued based upon the fact that he lived in a free state and free territory while he was a slave. The another part of the Who is Roger B. Taney. He was a Supreme Court justice that we read his summary of the case and why he ruled the way he did, which we'll get to here in a second. Takes place in 1856, 1857. That's when the case takes place. The background of it was 1833, 36. I don't remember, but we read it in class. It was 1830s. This is starting off in Missouri. Then he was taken to Illinois, which is a free state, and Wisconsin. The Supreme Court issued a statement led by Roger B. Taney that Dred Scott could not sue simply because he was property, he was not a citizen, and it kind of like expanded slavery into any of the free states, and then on top of that, any African American regarding this case could not be considered a citizen, could only be considered property regardless of whether they were free or slave, so therefore they did not have citizenship in the United States, didn't have any rights. The background of this case, like we talked about in class, abolitionist societies raised money for Dred Scott to provide him the means to have a lawyer to sue for his freedom. There's a drawing of Dred Scott. Okay, next big event is Lincoln-Douglas debates. This takes place in Illinois. This was a race for U.S. Senate seat in Illinois. We've already talked about Stephen Douglas. His name came up with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he kind of came up with the idea of popular sovereignty, being the law of the land for whether a new state could allow slavery or freedom. And so his stance on slavery at this point then is popular sovereignty. The state should decide whether they want to have slavery or not. And this is really kind of the beginning of Abraham Lincoln's career. He'd been around a little bit as a lawyer and other things, but this is where he really kind of starts to get notoriety. This takes place in 1858. Like I already said, this takes place in Illinois. And the central theme of these debates became the issue of slavery. Lincoln believed that it was wrong morally, religiously, and that slavery should not be allowed to spread any further. And on top of that, having part of the country be free and part of the country be slave was, completely unacceptable. And we'll look at one of his quotes here in a second. Whereas Douglas was a fan of what he called the Freeport Doctrine, which was like states get to vote whether they want to have slavery or freedom, and the federal government shouldn't have any say in it. It should be the state's right to determine whether they should have slavery. Douglas actually ends up winning this election, but Lincoln gains a lot of notoriety amongst abolitionists and amongst other Northerners. And this kind of launches his political career, and he runs for president in 1860, which we'll get to here in a second. One of the famous statements that Lincoln made during one of these debates was that a house divided cannot stand, saying that half the country can't be free and half the country be slave. That's never going to work. We've got to figure out how we can end slavery, that kind of thing. Okay. I want to make note here of Stephen Douglas's awesome hairdo. I think you could get out a surfboard and kind of go to town and surf in his hair. It's pretty sweet. Plus, he looks really happy. So does Lincoln. They both look really happy. All right, next big event we already talked about with John Brown. You guys did a little reading about him, and you saw some stuff about him already up to this point. So John Brown, like we already mentioned, was an abolitionist. He had some followers, including his sons, and they did a big raid on a federal arsenal in a town called Harper's Ferry, which is on the border of West Virginia and Virginia today. At that time, it was all Virginia. There was not a West Virginia yet. 10 of his men were killed when the Marines show up, and the rest were captured. Ultimately, most of them were killed in like the gunfights that took place, but then the remainder of them, for the most part, were executed for treason, that kind of thing, including John Brown. There's a picture of John Brown. This is before Kansas-Nebraska, Bleeding Kansas stuff. And so when when everybody realized it was him that killed the family in the Potawatomi massacre, he kind of disappeared for a little bit. And when he reappeared at Harper's Ferry, he had grown a big beard and all that kind of stuff. Just kind of, I think, probably to disguise himself. Well, the why, obviously we've already discussed this. He was an abolitionist. He hated slavery, thought it was completely horrible, and wanted to do anything he could to end slavery. The two names that kind of come up with this that become more pronounced later in our discussion of the Civil War is Robert E. Lee. He was the leader of the U.S. Marines at the time, and another guy that becomes a general during the Civil War as well is Jeb Stuart, and his name will come up quite a bit in the Civil War, so we'll see their names quite a bit. This is not going to be the last we see of them. The big kind of effect of this is that a lot of the people in the South started to realize that there were people in the North that were so against slavery they were willing to commit, treason, kill soldiers, and ultimately die for their cause. And so this kind of just draws a further wedge between the North and the South. And a lot of the Southerners started to realize that they're going to have to leave the United States to continue on with slavery. It's a picture of the arsenal. All right, next big event is election 1860. We've got 4 candidates in this. A couple of the names have already come up. Stephen Douglas, he was a Northern Democrat. John Breckinridge was a Southern Democrat. John C. Bell was Constitutional Union Party. They were wanting to try to keep the United States together. And then obviously Abraham Lincoln is the Republican candidate in 1860. Breckinridge gets most of the southern states, actually pretty much all of them aside from Tennessee, really. Douglas gets Missouri. Bell gets the border states. That would be like Kentucky, Tennessee. And then Lincoln gets all the northern states, but he wasn't even on the ballot in the South. But like we've already mentioned, the North has a ton of population compared to the South. The South was focused on agriculture and had a fairly sizable slave population, and so they didn't have nearly the population that could vote that the North did. So even though you couldn't even vote for him here in the South, he still wins, which clearly angers a lot of the people in the South that they couldn't even vote for him down here, but they were completely outnumbered by population, and so he doesn't even have any real competition to win this election from anybody in the South. This takes place in November of 1860, and then obviously it's in the United States. But the main where for this one, though, that you should include in your chart is that South Carolina said it would leave the United States. It would secede if Lincoln won. After Lincoln is elected in November, it's announced later that month, and then within just a few weeks, South Carolina secedes in December. The why, clearly to elect the President of the United States. So here's a map. I'm hoping I'm getting the colors right. The orange is Lincoln. You can see he wins all these states, big population, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, big population states, okay? And then down here you've got Breckinridge wins pretty much all of the South, but the deal with the South at the time was that, like we said, they don't have much population, so then him winning the South, even though it looks like it's about half the land, there wasn't that many votes simply because the population was so low. Then you've got Bell winning a lot of the border states here, Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, and then Douglas winning Missouri. All right, so there's Abraham Lincoln. All right, so the next big event is secession, and this ultimately leads to the Civil War. South Carolina, like we said, leaves in December of 1860. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas are close behind, and so pretty quickly you have quite a few states that have left the United States, really simply to preserve the right to own slaves, okay? Like we said at the beginning of this, some people will say it's states' rights, but it's ultimately the states' rights to have slaves, okay? People can make that argument all they want, but realistically, the states' rights argument is the states' rights to continue on the moral, disgusting thing of slavery, okay? All right. Crittenden, this dude kind of just appears out of nowhere. He'd been a politician a little bit, but his name hasn't heard a whole lot before this point. This was like the last plan to try to save the Union. He tries to come between the North and the South, and it was too little too late. Doesn't really come to much. In February of 1861, the Confederate States of America are formed, and now you've got the United States and the Confederate States, so two separate countries. And Jefferson Davis is elected president, and the first capital is in Montgomery, Alabama. Now you can't say it Montgomery. You got to eliminate the E. Even though there's an E in there, you can't pronounce it that way. It's got to be Montgomery. Montgomery. It's like there's an apostrophe there, and you just eliminate the E. It's kind of weird. All right. So anyways, that's the end of our notes for this. What you need to do is make sure that you've got this completed. You're going to bring this chart with you whenever we get back, whatever day that is, Monday, Tuesday, next week. I have no idea. It kind of depends on how much snow we get. But whenever we get back, have this with you so we can run through it really quickly. If you have any questions, bring those with you. We'll discuss it. Then we'll kind of get into a discussion of our essay test thing that we're going to do next week. I'll kind of give you some more details about my expectations for it and what you should plan for it, how you should set up your outline, that kind of thing. And then the day after we get back, so if we get back on Monday, we'll kind of go through this stuff, and then Tuesday we'd have the test. If we get back on Tuesday we go through this PowerPoint thing real quickly, and then Wednesday we'll have the test. Either way, it's going to be the next day after we get back is when we'll do our essay test. So you may want to start thinking about, what you think are the three main big events or causes of the Civil War, and then we'll kind of jump into how to plan for it. Ask me questions about your essay, and then we can kind of start getting that set up. Okay? I hope you guys enjoy your break, your unexpected break. Get outside and enjoy the snow, have some fun, enjoy your time with your family. I'm sure you guys will absolutely do that, and you won't hole up in your bedrooms playing video games and Snapchatting, Faceagramming, whatever it's called, doing all that kind of stuff. Enjoy your time. All right, see you when we get back.